Great. So welcome everyone to ROI Revolution. This is Catalyst, and we're very excited to bring you through our 5 rules for maximizing social media returns. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping. For those of you that need the next instructions, you probably can't hear me, but we want to make sure everyone is able to access the audio through the PIN number. Also, if you do have a question throughout the webinar, please use the question field to enter your question, and we will be saving time at the end to address your questions. So we are Catalyst. For almost 18 years now, we've been dedicated to driving business results to clients through search and social with a focus on advanced marketing strategy. So today, you'll be hearing Kieley Taylor, our head of paid social. She's going to be talking about many of the opportunities we've had to drive those business results for our clients. So we're going to ask a few polls throughout the webinar today, and the first one is here. What is the goal of your social media campaign? So we could just take a moment to provide an answer to the poll. Great, so we're just going to give a couple more seconds for people to participate in the poll. Okay, great, thank you. So what we see so far is 36% of you are focused on conversion, while 64% are focused on brand awareness and impression. So you're in the right place, because Kieley's going to talk a bit about really driving business results through the social media channels. So I will turn it over to Kieley. You can introduce yourself, Kieley, and take it away.
All right. Good afternoon or morning. I guess I'm not sure where everyone's dialing in from. My name is Kieley Taylor, and I oversee the paid social practice on behalf of Catalyst as well as the GroupM media agencies. And what I'm so thrilled about today is that 100% of our respondents said that they were optimizing their campaigns towards something that we would interpret as a business result. So perhaps we can even skip tip number 1, although since we're going through slides, I'm going to go ahead and walk through it as well. Maybe there's some other considerations for you to think about to apply towards your business. So firstly, social media is paid media, and it should drive business results. I say this meaning that organic impression delivery is really declining over time, and that means that there are dollars, real dollars, that need to be spent in order to have your ads delivered. So in a recent article, what we saw was that of digital ad spending, 1/4 of that is social and growing. However, most people were using it for branding, and there wasn't the same level of comfort in driving performance with those dollars. But our stance is, if you're spending $1, it should certainly still be accountable to performance, whether that be more of a brand building type of performance or a directly attributable ROI performance. And so the way that we think about the evolution of social is best portrayed in this chart here. So for those of you that have been following along with social for some time, it certainly all started with fans and fan acquisition. For a long time, the only people you could target were actually fans or friends of fans. And then as the years went on, different platforms were able to build out more and more sophisticated targeting segments. So you were able to amplify posts. Eventually, you didn't have to have a post appear on the page itself, which allowed for you to do a lot more posting to very specific audiences without presenting this multifaceted personality publicly on behalf of your brand. So that meant that you could have different types of offerings for those that are inclined to buy your competitor. You could have offerings specifically for those that were your most loyal customers. And the world of today really is about audience management. And while these rules have been applied across social, the world of programmatic dovetails really, really nicely into a lot of the thinking that we've been applying to social over the past several years within Catalyst. And so also going back to that number one tip, that we should be using social to drive business results. This is one of my favorite case studies. So not only am I a Hunger Games fan, but this is actually work that I am so proud of our teams for doing. So what once would have been a success measure for a social campaign, we trended globally in 45 minutes. It certainly is an accomplishment. The part that I'm even more proud of is that we were able to drive $2.1 million in sales in the first 3 days and to release number one on iTunes. So real tangible benefits and return. I like to refer to it as things that the CMO can tell the CFO, because that's kind of what makes the world go round. So again, all of these different attributes of this campaign were deemed as successful, but we went much further than the ability to trend and create buzz and word of mouth, but we went to a place that we were able to accurately quantify what that revenue impact was. Moving on to the second tip, it's about integrated strategy. So planning with your audience in mind. So this is our audience first planning framework, and I'm going to walk you through each of these 6 steps. So objectives, playing off of that first tip, should be aligned with your business objectives. If you have multiple media channels in market, objectives is an opportunity for you to define the role that you want social to fulfill. For example, what we tend to see happen with large enterprise advertisers is they have lots of awareness that's already being generated from TV. They have strong brand health and a well-known name that's easily recognized, so their branded search performs really well. But then there's a whole bunch of people in the middle who are aware but are not considering that brand. So that's a place that we think social can really work well. So in this instance, as an example, the objective might be to drive consideration through relevant audience targeting on social. At that point in time, we'd want to figure out who we wanted to talk to. So if the goal was to drive relevance and to increase household penetration, as an example, then we would probably not want to target so much of our existing customer base, but we'd want to target people that shop the category or perhaps are loyal to a competitor. After we know who we're trying to target, then we can all work together to identify what actions we want them to take. Actions is kind of still a little bit tricky in terms of social and measurement, because the actions that are easiest to measure are not always the most relevant for actual ROI. So for example, the rise of video has been really prominent on platforms like Facebook and Twitter and Snapchat. However, an action of a completed video view doesn't actually tell you what the intended outcome was for that person having exposure to that ad. So when we are briefed, our agency teams are briefed on things like completed video views, we try to ask one more level of question, one more level deep. So once they've watched our video in full, what do we want them to take away? Do we want them to think about the brand in a different way? Do we want them to be more educated? Do we want them to be aware of a new use case or usage occasion? So really making sure that even if there's an easy to collect measure, it's also going to deliver a meaningful action back to the brand. And then this is where content should be developed. Kind of if and only if those 3 key steps of objectives, defining audiences, and defining actions has taken place. Because otherwise content is being developed, but it's not being necessarily built for purpose, and it also will likely be a little bit lowest common denominator, or otherwise won't be as relevant as it could be to different audience segments. From there, once we know what the content is, distribution is kind of the bread and butter of an organization like Catalyst or like GroupM, where we go to make sure that we deliver impressions where the audience is and where we're able to at an efficient cost. And from there, we measure to make sure that what we'd initially planned on is delivering to the outcomes initially decided for that campaign. And this is a really important nuance. The world of social was built upon quote unquote free impressions and organic distribution. But what that led to was kind of some bad habits, which meant that lots of content would be developed, but not necessarily in the spirit of a campaign. So an example I like to share about kind of old social, where there was a lot of earned opportunity, was for a chocolate chip brand that I had worked on. So in this example, the chocolate chip brand had some equity creative. So it was gooey chocolate chip cookies being brought out of the oven. You could almost smell the cookies all the way through your screen. And so then the tail wags the dog. We have baking content that looks delicious. People that we should target will be people that like baking, people that like chocolate chip cookies, people with a sweet tooth. And then, 2 days later come around in the content calendar, and there is a line extension. And for this chocolate chip morsel, it actually had a couple different flavors of fillings. So there was one that was filled with mint, one that was filled with peanut butter. And so the people that we started to target to be really relevant to the creative that was already built were, for the peanut butter filled one, people that liked Reese's peanut butter cups. For the people that liked Andy's mints, York peppermint patties, they got the mint chocolate chip version. And then new day comes in the content calendar, and it was an opportunity to live tweet Game of Thrones. I can't see anyone shaking their head or wondering why Game of Thrones might index to baking. As far as I could tell, it didn't, but the content was approved, and nonetheless, we had to work to have a really engaging experience. So we looked at who would likely respond favorably to Game of Thrones focused content, and those folks were people that subscribed to HBO, perhaps they liked the author, they liked the book Game of Thrones, and maybe they liked baking, just to throw it in as for good measure. But when you take a step back and you think about who we were actually talking to, it was really, really disjointed. One of the baking people who was passionate about baking may have seen something about Game of Thrones, something about peanut butter filled chocolate chips, and a baking video. And then we started to not really mean anything to that person, assuming that they were paying attention to each and every ad that we delivered anyway. And the person that liked Game of Thrones got one chocolate chip cookie advertisement and probably never heard from us again. So really, from an effectiveness standpoint, those were reach and frequencies that weren't building towards a greater goal. So we have since shifted our approach with that brand and many others, and now we have an audience-focused approach. So in the example on the right, audience A is perhaps heavy buyers. Audience B could be people that buy from a competitor. So in this consumer packaged goods example, it could be someone who buys private label. We're going to want to have slightly more content for them because we have to educate them around the benefit and reasons to pay a premium for a brand versus a private label offering. And audience C might be people that are interested in baking, but maybe don't use chocolate as much. So you can see that some of the creative could work for a couple of those different audiences, but it was really important for us to know who we were trying to talk to, how often we thought we needed to communicate to them, depending on how much education would be required to get them to the eventual objective, and then to plan for purpose-built creative in deep partnership with our creative agencies. And so this gets even more exacerbated. That was a one brand example, but we also work on many enterprise brands. So this is an example where there's actually a fairly common audience in mind, but there were many different product offerings that may or may not have been relevant to that user at that time. So a quick case study to show how we've applied that type of framework and thinking, but applied it at an enterprise level. So in this instance, every single campaign was built from the bottom up, meaning that we identified sufficiency for creative, we identified how much of the target we needed to speak to on what platforms for what duration of time, but no one had a view for all of the conversations that that person maybe was exposed to across business lines. What we shifted to was having an awareness or a master brand message, which introduced people to a number of the different attributes from these different line extensions. And as they raised their hand in various ways, whether they were watching a video in full, whether they were going to a specific part of a website, whether they were engaging with a message on the platform. We then were able to build from the bottom up based on people that had in-market signals. So another example that we're very proud of, when we use this focused and consolidated approach, we were able to develop a Facebook Canvas ad that educated people across a variety of the different product lines while not stepping on each other's toes. And something that we hadn't been able to deliver when we were fighting for attention amongst a common audience was actually a 16% increase in ad recall, because it was very clear, firstly, what the brand, that master brand stood for, and then secondarily, how the product lines haloed up to that message, as well as were worthy of consideration in their own right. And the part that I really enjoy about this is not very often is there just more money that we can throw at a problem. When we had lots of competing messages, we actually, when looking at them in isolation, needed more money to solve the problem. But when we thought about it as a kind of a prospecting audience and then only serving those people that had raised their hands, we actually had the same budget and were able to deliver more impact, while also presenting a much more consistent voice for that brand to the customer. Ooh, poll time. So this question is, how often do you post? And I didn't cue up the Jeopardy music, and I will not try humming it. So we'll give the folks just a few more minutes to buzz in their answers.
Great, we'll give everyone just a few more seconds to respond to the poll. Great, thanks. So I won't dive into the results at this time, but I can tell you that the #1 answer was multiple times a week, followed by multiple times a day. But we will share the complete results.
All right, fantastic. So that was a well-planted poll. So tip 3 is still the marketing funnel, not the newsfeed. So for those of you that are posting either multiple times a day or multiple times a week, this is an illustration of a brand that we worked with that had a very similar content posting cadence. So we had taken over and transitioned this brand. So in 2015, this had been their approach. So general targeting was adults 13 to 49. We had the opportunity to reach 93 million people on Facebook. And then each of these colored dots in the middle represent the actual impressions delivered against any one piece of content. So while there was a large scaled opportunity to talk to the audience, on average, each post delivered about 4 million impressions, or about 3 out of every 100 people that were relevant to that brand actually saw any one piece of content. What we shifted the focus on for 2016 and beyond, since it's been successful, is having fewer posts, but having more people that were relevant see them. So we still have the demo overlay of adults 13 to 49. This is specifically a brand that tends to have a strong affinity to football and Super Bowl. They tend to have a spot in the game, as well as a secondary target of Hispanic. So what we were able to do instead was deliver 31 million impressions per post with an average share of voice of 4 out of every 10 people that were relevant to that brand seeing that piece of content. It made for the messaging to be much more consistent, and it also allowed the opportunity to review each post with a little bit more rigor. Because there were fewer of them, that meant that also production dollars could be more focused to make sure that all posts were very high quality and definitely looked to be on brand. And so the transition to fewer with a lot more exposure can sometimes feel like walking up to a cliff and leaping off of it. So how are you to know that this piece of content, content A, is so much better than content B that it's worthy of 31 million impressions and the other should get 0? So one of the best options that we've identified is to partner with a company like Metrics Lab, METRIXLAB. And what they do is they do an ad simulated in a mock newsfeed. And then the measures of success that they identify for you include recall and reaction. So similar to Nielsen brand effect type outcomes. We found this to be incredibly helpful because engagement rate or view-through rate can be similar without actually correlating to an end business goal. Sometimes we call this the power of the puppies. So you can tend to deliver a really high engagement rate if you put a puppy into an ad, but how much does that halo actually back to your brand and to value for your customer? So this type of approach takes a lot of that noise out of the signal, and what you can see in the dark green and brighter green boxes, ideal and good, this gave us more confidence that name ad 3, obviously whitelisted, and name ad 4 should be those ads that were the campaign, whereas we didn't waste any impressions on name ad 2, which needed improvement and probably wasn't going to connect very well with our intended customer base. So not knowing enough about the balance between working and non-working media that you have within your organization. You may have already struck a great ratio, and that's fantastic. We want to make sure that we have the right content before we worry about right sizing non-working investment. That said, this is a case study that we have for a brand that, or excuse me, a collection of brands, a big enterprise client that over the course of about the last 18 months has been doing a number of those metrics studies. They've gotten much smarter over time about figuring out how best to communicate their brand promise to their audiences. And what ultimately they were able to do was develop less content overall. So this is a big major global advertiser. And what they were able to do as they better refined what works well in social and what resonated with their audiences was actually cut production by almost $10 million. In this instance, they had it returned into media investment rather than savings, but this is an opportunity as you get more rigorous in terms of how you evaluate what advertisement should appear in your social channels, and as you have more clear indications of what's working best for your brand, these are some of the opportunities that you can start to look for. And of course, as we're talking about ROI, there's the advertising cost as well as the rate of return. And if you're spending less overall in terms of advertising and you're getting the same return, that certainly is another way to think about ROI driving. All right, shifting from reactive real-time content to proactive right-time messaging is tip number 4. So to go quickly around this example, another social 1.0 or kind of original social where there were so many free impressions was to jump on any trend. So think about the Oreo dunk in the dark moment. In this example, we work with a diaper brand, and the thing that they wanted to make sure that they were associated with was celebrating births, both for the everyday type of person as well as celebrity births. So this provided the team a lot of guardrails. Who was to know who was going to become pregnant over the next 9 months, but once they did have their child, so like the example of Beyonce on the bottom right or Serena Williams in the top middle, we all knew that that was already an idea that was pre-approved with a budget associated to celebrate that type of birth. Whereas something like the Chicago Cubs surprisingly winning the World Series, well, probably a mixed crowd, winning the World Championship last year was probably very interesting, but not on brand. And so we were able to quickly assess that that was not something that we needed to jump on the bandwagon for. An illustrative example, major holidays are another. If you're posting multiple times a week, you tend to post around major holidays. What you'll find is there's even more clutter, and it's that much harder for your brand to break through. This is actually a collection of Halloween posts on behalf of an enterprise advertiser, not to mention all the other advertisers that were also out on the feed that day. And then we've also done some studies to identify that it actually is more costly from a CPM perspective to have a flight that is less than 3 days versus having a flight that's 3 days or longer. You can see pretty significant savings, especially in Twitter. If we're not needing to be live just in that moment, it gives the algorithm a longer window to optimize towards better CPM delivery. Then lastly, taking social out of a silo. So hopefully you've seen the numerous benefits of integration that we've already spoken to within the webinar so far. But when looking at it, even just through the lens of search and social, what you find is that being relevant in social means that you inform a more qualified audience to search for you actively through branded search terms, something that we know that tends to perform very, very efficiently. And there's not a lot of ways to scale branded search other than to bring net new users in who are qualified and interested. So this is one of the dynamics that we have seen. To learn a little bit more about that, we have a couple of other pieces of collateral. So if you search for my name, Kieley Taylor at CMO.com, you can find that strategy as well as the Why Search and Social Equals Success for Brands white paper. Thank you so much for joining.
Great, thank you, Kieley. So folks, we'll answer a few questions real quickly, and then you will receive a survey as soon as you close out of the window. So we ask you please take a moment to participate in the survey and let us know if you have any additional questions. So Kieley, the first question that came in was, when you create different audiences within one campaign, will you exclude the other audiences of the campaign while setting up each new audience, just so you aren't running against your other ads?
Yes, I'd certainly recommend that as a best practice.
Great. And just one more, how much should we ballpark spend per post?
Sure, so I get this question quite a bit. I would actually recommend, if you thought about those 6 bubbles, objectives, audience, actions, content, distribution, measurement, to think about how large is the audience that you're wishing to speak to, and making sure that you are talking to somewhere between 40 and 60% of that qualified audience. That will give you a much better way to project out budget rather than per post, because it's a little bit more directly correlated to what your overall impact could be.
Great. Thank you, Kieley, and thank you everyone for attending today. If you have any questions, please reach out to us at info@catalystdigital.com. We'd love to hear from you and talk about how we could help you further with your social campaigns in the future. Great. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.